Hey everyone, this is week 4 and we are going to discuss or most of my voiceover really is just going to be on chapter 10, and I'm going to ask you to review on your own chapters 12 through 14, which have a lot to do with research methods, so it'll be a review from our last class. Your writing lab is for you to put together a draft of your budget and also justification pages for your budget, and then also to continue working on your intervention and surveys that everybody will be reviewing and taking the surveys in week 5. Just a few reminders for this week. This Sunday, you have 2 things that are due. One is quiz 2, which again includes chapter 5, 10, and then 12 through 14. So be sure to not only listen to this voiceover and my lecture right now, but also go to those all of those slides that are available in Cougar Course. So the ones that have the full chapters slides. So this is just me condensing it, but don't forget to go back to the original slides. But again, it's all on Cougar Course. And then also due on Sunday are your PowerPoint, voiceover presentations, and your surveys. So those again are kind of like your mock programs or your mock interventions, and then you're going to have an evaluation of that content. So again, those are the 2 things that are due on Sunday. So again, this is chapter 10, and we're talking more about resources and budgets and identifying and allocating them. How do you work with a budget? Okay, first of all, before we can have a budget, we need a grant. Well, for the most part. But you can get grants in a variety of places. It can be from a foundation, from a corporation. There's a ton of health agencies that offer grants. Typically in academia, especially in public health, we're applying to NIH grants, National Institute of Health. But as far as government, you can look up all their grants at grants.gov. There's also a federal register for grants. You could look in the internet. And overall, kind of just searching for proposal requests or requests for applications. So there are plenty of places where you can at least search for grants. And then, of course, again, they come at different levels. So they could be local grants for your immediate area. They can be for the state, or they can be national grants. Again, kind of like NIH or CDC grants. Those are all national grants. Okay, so how do you prepare a budget? Well, first off, a budget is really itemizing your whole program. So what is it that you need? Who are you going to hire? And it's usually broken down into 12-month periods. So if you have a 2-year project, you want to name the years and outline, how much are you spending the first year, how much are you spending the second year, etc. And you're going to break it down by a lot of different categories. And the person who develops the budget is really those who are planning the program, because you know what resources you need and what resources are going to be used or need to be used for the program. So again, the budget, especially for grants, typically is very itemized so that you can estimate the total cost of the program budget. So steps in the budgeting process. First, you want to look at the objective or the financial objective of the program. And really, especially for this class, we looked at NIH type grants. You want to look at that program announcement or that request for application. So wherever you decided, whichever RFA or PA that you grabbed onto, that information about your grant, that's where you're going to find the budget information of what you are able to at least apply for. You might even find, and think about what is the expected revenue for some other types of grants. That's not applicable to us. We're not selling anything or charging for services or programs or anything like that. So really there should generally be no revenue in an NIH type grant, especially if we're offering a program, to a community. But of course, there's a lot of expenditure. So you really, again, have to think about who's your personnel, what materials or supplies do you need, um, also thinking about fringe benefits and insurances, how much someone is working. So you really get down into the details of what you need and who is going to do it, and how much does all of that cost. And of course, you always want to monitor your budget, because your budget is your best possible guess. And hopefully it's within, the range, a very small range. But of course, things are always shifting. You might not need something, or you might need something more, or someone gets paid less if they leave early. So things are always kind of shifting, within this range that we did an estimate for the budget. So it's always good to make sure you're monitoring and adjusting as needed. Now, there are two types of costs. And this is really, really important to understand. There are direct costs. So this is what pays directly for your program. And again, this is your personnel, the personnel salaries, this is the supplies, this is anything that you have to pay in order to make sure your program works at a direct level. So it's the product, the service, the people. An indirect cost is the portion that kind of indirectly helps you. So in that way, think about administrative costs, telephones, well, especially if you're in a university. Think about, for example, my position, all the things that I have that are helping me do my work. So I have a telephone, obviously I have light and an office space. The university pays for insurance. There's equipment like my desk and the computer, and other things in my office. There are also administrative folks that are available to me that I can ask, can you help me submit this grant, or can I get advice on this? So all of these things get paid through indirect costs. So if you bring in a big grant, there's usually an indirect cost related to it, and that goes to the university. So that's another way that you can kind of look at it. I mean, it all goes to the university, but kind of think about how it's spent. The direct cost in some way kind of goes to you as the primary principal investigator, and you're deciding how it's being spent as far as your program. The indirect costs is a portion of the grant that goes to the university or goes to an employer or some entity, and they're the ones who disperse it and decide how that gets spent. So again, the direct cost goes directly to your particular program, and the indirect cost kind of goes to something a little bit larger. So for university, it's kind of overhead administrative costs. It could go to an employer or a foundation, but again, the indirect costs go to that larger entity and they decide. Now, the reason that this is important is that there are two ways to look and understand IDC, or the indirect costs. If you have a grant, it could be inclusive of your indirect costs, or it could be not inclusive. So typically, I think here at Cal State San Marcos, our indirect cost is 49.5%. So let's just round up to 50%. There's other universities, especially the tier 1 research universities, they might have indirect costs of 70%. But for us at Cal State San Marcos, it is, let's just say 50%. So if I went to a foundation and I found a grant for $150,000, because it's a foundation, many times it might include indirect costs. So that means $150,000 is my total program costs, which means $100,000 would be my direct costs, and 50% of that, which is $50,000, would be the indirect costs, and now that adds up to $150,000. So again, if it includes IDC, you have to work that into the larger budget. So again, if I found $150,000 for a grant, but it includes IDC, I have to back calculate and say, okay, what is the cost of my program? And then 50% of that, and that has to add up to $150,000. What we really like, and this is true for NIH grants, is when the IDC is not included in the program cost that you see as far as your overall budget. So for example, again, now I'm looking at, let's say, an NIH grant, and it's for $150,000, but IDC is not included. That means my direct cost is $150,000. And now I have to calculate the indirect cost at 50%, which is $75,000, and that gets added to 150. So now my overall program and total budget cost is $225,000. So that's why it's nice when indirect costs are not included, because then you get 50% of your costs on top of that. So again, when an IDC is not included, you're adding that 50% on. So again, if I was looking at a $150,000 grant and IDC is not included, that 150 goes to me as a direct cost, and then 50% of that goes as the indirect cost, 75,000, which makes the grand total 225. So those are the differences, again, between direct costs, indirect costs, and then really understanding whether or not a grant is saying that the indirects are included in the total or if they are not included, which of course is the one we like, because then we end up getting more more money, more for the program. So hopefully that was clear. Direct versus indirect, and also included IDC versus not included IDC. Here's a sample budget sheet, very simple. To me, it looks like it's coming from a foundation because you see gifts, grants, participant fee. Again, there's some revenue there. Sale of some type of material. Now again, that larger category is not going to be so much related to the types of budgets I want you to create, but it's good to see an example. And then here's some more typical expenditure. So direct costs, you have your personnel, you have supplies, and that's broken down. Equipment, travel, I would say either like advertising, or sometimes I do a line for like printing. And then you have your total direct costs. Indirect costs, there's a line for that. And then again, at the bottom, that's your total. So this is an example from one of my grants that I applied to. You don't have to have this much detail as far as all the columns, such as key, type, monthly, and number of months, etc. You don't need that type of detail, but definitely, especially for personnel, you want to have their salary. Go ahead and have their base and their monthly. And FTE is full-time employment. So if someone's working for you full-time, you're going to have 100%. If you're only, hiring someone at 50%, then you're going to put 50%. And then also don't forget to include fringe benefits. So go ahead and you can come up with your own numbers, but you can also just use the numbers I have here. So if it's someone like a main personnel that might be working at the university, like the director or the manager, go ahead and have their fringe benefits cost at 47%. And then if it's someone you're hiring or a student or some type of an assistant, have their fringe benefits at 17%. And then if you look across the rows, you can see how that's calculated. And then again, you're going to have, if this is a 2-year grant, you're going to have year 1 and year 2, and then you're going to have the total for each. Now, if we look down as far as the total project cost, my hunch looking at this is probably maybe a $300,000 grant. What I would do, especially with your budgets, is actually try to get the grant to the penny as close as possible. But the reason I say that is because, so it's $262,000 for the total direct costs. And then your IDC, which sometimes is called F&A, which is facilities and administration, almost blanked. So again, it's kind of named differently, but it's indirect costs or F&A, facilities and administration. So again, that's going to be 49.5. For us, we can just do 50%. So about 50% of 262,000 is 129. So adding those together, the total project cost is $391,000. This one looks like the IDC was not included, especially if it's an NIH grant. So maybe it was a $300,000 grant. Then you would add half of that. If you were just using plain numbers, 300 and then plus 150, then it would be a $450,000 grant. So again, this is probably, this is an example of one that did not have IDC included. Now I have more examples of the budget and also budget justification. You are free to use my examples. The only thing I ask is that you make it very relevant to the project you're proposing. I don't mind, using the same language around, supplies or personnel, but just make sure when you change the description, you change the justification. In this, academic world, a lot of times we share, like, here's my budget and here's my justifications. So I don't mind you really using the formats that I already have and the examples that I gave you. Just make sure you're really thinking through it and making sure that you're tailoring to your specific program. So now when we talk about resources can be human resources, fiscal, technical, it could be the curriculum. Some carry a price tag, so you know how much they cost. But then there are also some type of resources that are free or inexpensive. Now, personnel. This is who you need to actually carry out your program or your intervention, etc. You can have internal personnel, so people who are already working with you or for you, and then you can also have external personnel or a combination. It might be things that you want to think about is, capacity building or technical assistant, having some volunteers, how are you working and thinking about teamwork, and also cultural factors like cultural competence. And again, you have to think about what is needed for your particular program. Now there's some advantages and disadvantages to using internal versus external personnel. For internal, it does reduce costs. You're not hiring someone outside as a consultant. You can make internal arrangements and you have a little bit more control. An external person, they might have more expertise or might not. But what's nice is that you can request certain guarantees as far as timeline, as far as product, and they may also be able to reach different priority populations in different areas than you might be able to do. But of course, there are some disadvantages of working with external personnel, such as the cost, limitations because they are consultants, and therefore you have less control. So you have to really decide if that outweighs the disadvantage for internal, which could be, limited staff who might be interested in a project, the training that's involved, and also spending time developing the program where you might be reaching fewer people. So again, there's advantages and disadvantages to considering whether you would include internal or external personnel, or even a combination of both. Now, when we talk about curriculum, it's really the lesson or the intervention that you're giving. You can develop something in-house, so you yourself and your team are developing it, and that's something you have to include in your grant potentially, especially if you're thinking about timeline, when are things going to get developed, or it can be canned. So maybe there's something that already exists that you can reuse. But the main thing you want to really think about is, does it meet the needs of your program, and especially does it meet the needs of your priority population? So you don't want to just throw in a canned program just because it's already available. You really have to think, will it work for what you intend to do with your program? Doing something in-house it takes a lot of time. You have to really think through creating it from scratch. A lot of places already have up-to-date information, so you might be able to work that into something that you're developing. But again, the thing that you want to remember is that just because there's something available, that doesn't mean it's appropriate for your project or appropriate for your community or priority population that you're working with. So many times you do have to develop something in-house because there's something very specific about the program or about the people that you want to make sure that you are capturing. And sometimes there is something that is available that's already developed, which is nice. You have to just keep in mind that canned programs oftentimes are developed using mainstream, populations and communities. So you just want to be mindful of understanding how that program was made and for whom it was tested on or made for, so that you can decide if you can use that canned program. Generally, those kind of programs already come with participant manuals, manuals for the instructor, materials, training, marketing materials, etc. So it's really nice because there's very little or sometimes even no time spent on development. But again, it may or may not fit the needs of your population, and that's something you have to consider when thinking about using a canned program. So again, here are just some questions that you need to ask yourself. Is it based on best practices? Is the program effective? Is it scientifically and educationally sound? Is it enjoyable for your population? Or can it be something that can be modified for your particular community or priority population? So those are just a couple questions to ask yourself when considering using a program that already exists. So there's some organizations that actually are starting to keep this information, which I think is great. So SAMHSA, for example, has a website, and they have programs listed that they have labeled, evidence-based programs and practices, and they're saying that, these seem to be, pretty good interventions or programs that they want to share and make sure that they're disseminating. So again, if you're doing something related to SAMHSA, which is Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, it'd be great to look at their website because they do actually already have a lot of programs that you may be able to use. Space. So you really have to think about where is this going to be held, and of course it depends on what type of program you have. Is it something where there's physical activity? Is it something where participants just need to sit and listen? Really think about what type of space you need. There are a lot of inexpensive ways for space. You can think about working with schools, universities, religious facilities, or other type of community rooms. Could be in a library. So you just have to think about those potential spaces depending on your project. But oftentimes, free space is not always free. There still might be other charges. But definitely really think about space and where your program would be held, because that's something you want to consider in your budget as well. And then, of course, in your budget, you want to think about equipment. What is it? So equipment is non-consumable. So what is it that you own that might be you can loan from others, or it's on loan from others? Equipment is something, I want to say, almost tangible. You can touch it. You need this type of equipment to be able to do your project. Supplies, they're consumable. I mean, I guess they're tangible too, but you use them and then they're kind of done. So when I think of consumable items, I think of like paper and pens and things that you use but are kind of, it's not something that you would have at the end of your program that you could loan or things like that. So it's something that the person who's planning the project provides, That's something that either your team or the participants use. So the difference between equipment and supplies is determined by the monetary value or the life of the commodity. So again, equipment is non-consumable. It's something that's there that you own, whereas supplies is something that you use that is consumable, expendable, and might not be there by the end. So something that you are using. So again, that's equipment versus supplies. And then, of course, related to this, planner must also determine, what is the necessary equipment that you need and what supplies do you need. Identify the sources, and then, working that into a budget and finding a way to pay for your equipment and supplies. Planners often make tough decisions about how to allocate funds. So some questions you might want to think about is, is it better to run an adequately financed program for a few people or to run a poorly financed program for more people? Hopefully you know the answer to that one. Or maybe not. Maybe it is a question that you have to think about. If funds are limited, where can you make cuts? And you have to think about this all the time. One of the tricks that I think a lot of people do is to kind of pad your budget. So you're adding a little bit more in certain areas that you may be able to cut from. And that's always because many times, although you submit a proposed budget, it's just a proposal. And someone could come back and say, okay, I know you proposed $300,000, but we want you to do this project with $200,000. So you really have to already have in mind, how could you limit your funds if you need to. Should a program be started knowing funds will fall short? I don't think so. Or should you delay? Is it better to have fewer instructors or make do with fewer supplies? So these are all things that you have to kind of grapple with as you're thinking about how much money do you have, what are the resources that you need, and what is that balance in between being, having enough with good quality or using your resources in a different way to be more efficient with the funds. But again, there's no correct answer that can apply to every situation. Those are questions that you have to ask yourself as you're creating the budget. And then also ways to finance programs. There can be participant fees. Again, in our work, generally we don't have that because we're trying to offer programs so people can be healthy. But there's cost sharing, there's cooperative agreements, so that maybe you have some type of understanding for shared space, so you don't have to pay for space. There's a lot of volunteer organizations, and then sometimes there's grants, gifts that could relate to your grant. So there are different ways that you can finance programs overall, but for the type of grant that we're writing up for this class, it's largely just the grant itself and budgeting what you need in order to execute that program. All right, so the next chapters, 12 through 14, have a lot to do, 12 has a lot to do with logic models, and then 13 and 14 have a lot to do with evaluation approaches and designs. So again, you want to think about how that relates to pH 507, and this should really be more of a review of research methods. Again, thinking about different approaches and different types of study designs. So I will leave you to review these next chapters. And if you have any questions, as always, let me know, and I'm glad to have a meeting with you. Thanks.